The Blaze Radio Network. On demand.
Today on the podcast, by the way, it's Stu, along with Glenn Beck.
Hi,
he's
I'm
the
Glenn.
host of the program.
Yeah, I'm your host.
You will hear that wonderful voice talking about the New Mexico arrests.
I'm not a stand-in.
In which some very non-religious people were taken in with guns they bought from the NRA.
Yes.
And
Dana Lash was there.
I think she was there.
I know it.
I know it. That is the way it's being treated.
There's an amazing story about how the press is ignoring what really happened, where a jihadist has set up a terror camp here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some connections to the Democratic Party, and that's really why you're not hearing about it.
We'll also talk about fake news. You know, there's been this debate about whether the news and fake news and the press is the enemy of the people. How far do you take that? How much of it is true? We sort of dissect that one on the program today.
Mm-hmm. Also, we have Ben Weingarten on. He's going to talk about another scandal. Everybody is speculating about the speculation and the opinions that you hear on the news about Donald Trump and collusion in Russia. Why don't we wait for the facts? In the meantime, let's make sure we hold everybody's feet to the fire. What's happening with Dianne Feinstein? It's more than just the spy that loved her and was driving her around. There is a real problem, and Ben Weingarten is going to spell that out.
And we talking about this New Mexico story, where one of the people tied to it was involved as a unindicted co-conspirator in the 93 World Trade Center bombing. Also, a character witness for the Blind Sheikh. We decided to figure out who should we call. How about Andrew McCarthy? The lead prosecutor in that case.
Yeah. Do you know this guy? Are you surprised that his son turned out this way? Wait till you hear his answer. Also, if you feed Friskies to your cats, you're a bad human being, we found out today. And Space Force. Donald Trump and Space Force, all on the podcast.
Glenn Beck.
Jihadist training camp found in New Mexico. That is the headline that should be everywhere in America today. Let me say it again. Jihadist terror camp found in New Mexico. It's not the one you're reading, though, is it? I would ask you to check out MSNBC to see how they're reporting this story. They don't really find it newsworthy, as just a few minutes before we went on the air. Imagine that. What about CNN? Their headline reads, "Children found in New Mexico compound training for school shootings," prosecutors say. That's their headline, which leads to all kinds of fake news on Twitter. All of the people saying, thanks, Dana Lash and the NRA. All of the people who are now betting that this is an NRA member. Why? Because they're not including all of the details in the story. So let's do that for them. You decide what this story is about. Here's what we know so far. Police raided a remote New Mexico property last Friday. They were looking for a missing boy. Now, here are the details. See if there's an overriding theme here that might change a headline or two. A Georgia woman had reported that her 6th son was kidnapped by her now separated husband. He had driven all the way from Georgia to New Mexico to perform an Islamic ritual on his son. It's called Ruqya. Now, the arrest warrant claims the father wanted to perform an exorcism on his child, but the mother said it was a translation error. So now how can you screw up a word like exorcism? Well, I'll come back to it. See, if you use the word exorcism, now it's a compound training kids to shoot kids out in the middle of nowhere, and they're performing exorcisms. What does that sound like, Stu?
Let's see. It's a tough one.
Does it sound like a Muslim or a Christian camp?
I was going to go Jehovah's Witness.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Sure. Mm-hmm. The alleged kidnapper's name is Siraj Wahaj.
Right in the pocket of the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
His family, let's just say, has a little bit of a checkered background. His father is a New York City area imam that heads a mosque there.
No, it doesn't sound so bad.
No, it doesn't, except he was also named as an unindicted co-conspirator of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. He was also a character witness for the defense of the blind friggin' sheep in 1995. A character witness. When police raided the New Mexico property, they found 11 children, ages 1 to 15. They were dirty, barely dressed, and had no food or water. People who do this for a living said this is the worst squalor they have ever seen children found in. The house was made into a makeshift protected compound with tires and wooden pallets creating a fortified wall. Wahaj was armed with an AR-15 and 4 handguns. In total, 5 adults were arrested.
Thanks a lot, NRA.
3 women, all wearing Islamic headscarves, and 2 men. Got any themes yet? I mean, it sounds like... you wouldn't...
Sounds like it's directly from the National Rifle Association.
Great. Now, Islamic extremism may be involved here.
What?
Well, the Taos County Sheriff said the kidnappers were considered heavily armed and, quote, extremists of the Muslim belief, end quote. That's the police and their quote. Let me give you the CNN
what's their
headline
motivation?
again.
What's their motivation?
Well, I don't know because
we may never know.
No, CNN headline is children found in New Mexico compound training for school shootings. Again, extremists of the Muslim belief, end quote. They also said the children were being trained to perform school shootings. Oh, and let me just go back to the exorcism, that messed up translation on the word exorcism. It's actually pretty easy to explain. And this does make you an extremist, I just want to point out. There is an exorcism. It's a rite in Islam called, I think it's Ruqya. It's Ruqya. But jihadists use the same word as exorcism, or Ruqa, when they pray over a sick person. And not just any sick person. When a Muslim believes that a child or someone else is sick due to Western medicine, they have to perform this ritual to get all of the Western out of them. You know, the Crusaders and their evil modern-day medicines have to be taken out through religious ritual. They don't sound like Muslim extremists at all to me. Do you?
No, I haven't even sniffed a tie so far, other than the police saying it directly.
So let me ask you this. How does anyone know these facts and write the headline, Children Found in New Mexico Compound Training for School Shootings? Prosecutors say. Well, prosecutors also said they were extremists of the Muslim belief. Isn't that interesting? Well, they don't want you to focus on this story because there's something else that came out overnight. This guy who was running this camp, yeah, he was I want to see if I want to get this exactly right. If I have it here, do I have it? I have it. Yeah, here I have it. I want to use the exact words. He was a, quote, mentor, motivator, and encourager of mine. You know who said that? Linda Sarsour.
Who's Linda Sarsour?
Well,
who's that? Was that some right-wing activist? Gun activist, I bet. Is it Dana Lash's brother?
See, let me explain to anybody who doesn't listen to the show all the time, or if you happen to be listening, at Media Matters or wherever. This is why Americans don't trust the press. Yesterday, they're still going on about collusion. They have nothing. They have opinions. They have speculation. And most of the news is opinions about speculation. They don't have any facts. But when they do have facts and it doesn't fit their narrative, they don't cover it. This is a really big story. When you look at forget about Linda Sarsour for a minute. when you just look that we have found a Muslim extremist terror training camp, and they were training children to go in and kill children, is there a more important story than that today? Is there a more important story than that today? I have said for a very long time, and if we have time today, we're going to cover this. Beslan is the thing that would destroy this country, would tear us apart. And that is what happened in Beslan, Russia. Chechnyan extremists, Muslim extremists, went in on the first day of school and slaughtered these children. I mean, it was horrible. You might remember it. It happened right at the same time the Chechnyan extremists took over the, I think it was a theater, a ballet or something like that in Moscow, and they ended up having to gas all of those people. This was horrifying, absolutely horrifying what happened. And it has been a shock to me, and thank you, FBI. It has been a shock to me that they haven't done this yet. Well, you're training 15 kids to go into schools and shoot people? What do you think that would do to us? And who do you think it would be blamed on? Islam or the NRA? How many people would defend the actions of these terrorists and blame it on the NRA, even if they knew it was a Muslim extremist camp? I would think many in the press. So it's not just their agenda on the NRA that is making them leave out all of the Islamic extremists. It is also their I don't know, coddling of Islamic extremists, the out-and-out denial that these things are happening in our country. They don't want to say those things, but this story goes deeper. This story goes to Linda Sarsour. Now, who is Linda Sarsour?
One of the founders and heads of the Women's March.
Oh, really? You mean the Women's March that is going against Trump?
Yes.
The same Women's March that went and she brought all of these big leaders of all of these radical groups and the Democratic Party in to see Louis Farrakhan, but it was no big deal?
No big deal.
That lady. Okay. Linda Sarsour. You mean Linda Sarsour, the one who advises and counsels with the heads of the Democratic Party. That Linda Sarsour?
Mm-hmm.
Linda Sarsour came out at the last ISNA conference, and this is how she started her speech.
And to my favorite person in this room, that's mutual, is Imam Siraj Wahaj, who has been a mentor, a motivator, an encourager of mine, someone who has taught me to speak truth to power and not worry about the consequences, someone who has taught me that we are on this earth to please Allah and only Allah, and that we are not here to please any man or woman on this earth. So I'm grateful to you, Imam Siraj, and you might think this is weird, but every once in a while when I get into that deep, dark place, Imam Siraj comes and talks to me. And then he helps me to emerge out of those spaces. So I'm grateful to you, Imam Siraj. May Allah bless you and protect you and keep you for a long time for our community, because we need you now more than ever.
They need him now more than ever. Unfortunately, Allah did not protect him, because his ass is rotten in jail today because her mentor, was training 15 kids to kill other kids. So you ask yourself, why isn't the media covering this? Well, because this will hurt the Democratic Party. That's why. That is the only reason why. This hurts the narrative of the left. The narrative of the left that all of Islam is peaceful. It is not. About 10% is not. And that's a lot of people. The Islamist states, they are cruel, brutal, and as bad as any Nazi ever was, but it's against women, not just Jews, women, homosexuals. What the hell are you doing? Fellow Americans who vote differently than me, but you still have compassion and a heart. What are you doing? These people want to kill. They want to kill homosexuals. They will abuse women. Yesterday, I posted something on Twitter. It's in Arabic. I guess maybe we could play it and I could read the translation to you. But it's an Arabic guy on the streets in the Middle East asking, what would you do if your sister went out and got a job? I'd kill her. That was the answer. I'd kill her. Why? Because she's dishonoring me. She's dishonoring my family. Over and over and over again. Please don't talk to me about how oppressive the hierarchy here in America is. Can we focus on something a little bigger? How can you possibly lay any ties down with people who believe that? Well, I don't know who those people are. Okay, we do know this. Linda Sarsour, a person the DNC is in bed with deeply. Linda Sarsour, somebody that the media all just airs like she is some princess from heaven. She's a radical. It's not a one-off that those people were sitting with Louis Farrakhan. It's not. This was her mentor. And America, this is the kind of fake news that is being squashed. This is why the media is not trusted, because we have her in her own words praising, saying he comes to her in her darkest times to counsel. He's a mentor. He's a killer. But the press can't even bring themselves to tell you that he's Muslim, let alone the ties to Linda Sarsour and the Democratic leadership.
Glenn Beck.
Get ready, because socialism is coming, or at least a version of socialism. Let's call it campus socialism. You know, the kind of socialism that you can enjoy while sipping your venti soy latte at Starbucks and posting anti-Trump memes on Reddit. The latest example is Rashida Tlaib. She won the Democratic primary in Michigan's 13th district, and she's going to run unopposed in the November general election. Here she is speaking with CNN about her motivation for running for Congress.
You were actually at an event, a Trump speech. This was 2 years ago in Detroit, and you, along with several others, were forcibly removed from that speech for heckling. I mean, you tell me, Rashida, how much of your decision to run was shaped by this president?
Look, I say this a lot to people, but it's true. I think President Trump being there in office, getting elected, was kind of a bat signal for women across the country. It was like, it's our time. We have to march on, and we can't stand outside of the ring anymore. We have to actually run for office, and we have to demand to have a seat at the table, because it's obvious that everything else is falling apart. And to have someone like him in office that talks like him, I mean, our children have to watch that, hear that language and watch that kind of behavior. And so absolutely, I think a lot of that drive does come from, President Trump being in office, and the culture and atmosphere.
Here's a woman who is running as a Democrat because things are falling apart, and it's Donald Trump's fault, and she's speaking to us from the great city of Detroit. So, first thing you should do is check out the video. It is not the kind of unhinged behavior you want from an elected official, at least not one for me. She was one of 14 protesters ejected from a luncheon for heckling. You have to see it, because she didn't go without a fight. Security literally had to drag her out backwards as she was screaming and wagging her finger. Now, in an interview with Detroit Free Press after the incident, she said, "We need to be heard. You cannot stay silent. He doesn't love Detroit. He doesn't love no one who isn't Donald Trump." Help me out with that sentence, please, Stu.
He does love people who aren't
Donald Trump.
He doesn't love no one, so he does love someone.
Yeah, he doesn't love no one who isn't Donald Trump. Okay, so ridiculous statement. It's easy to shrug off. If the entire argument, her entire argument is that that he's a monster that doesn't love Detroit, and that allowed her to beat 5 Democrats. The media has celebrated this so-called rise of women against Trump. They've rejoiced that she will be the first Muslim member of Congress. They love the fact that she's the daughter of Palestinian immigrants.
Wait, she won't be the first, right? Keith Ellison.
First Muslim woman.
First Muslim woman. Got it.
All of these things are just, that's just a feast for them. The very thought that they can check so many of the virtue points floods them with elation. So let's go back to the idea. One of her prime objectives is to impeach President Trump. Here's what she said, quote, she doesn't cite any of the grounds for impeachment because she believes, and I quote, Donald Trump has committed a number of crimes that will come to light when we start the impeachment hearings, end quote. I think that's the Inquisition. We could spend a week on pointing out the hypocrisy in this statement, but perhaps it's better just to keep it short. It's time for all of us to get our houses in order, or else tantrums like these are going to keep happening, and we are going to send more and more really angry people to Washington, and that's not a good thing. Because angry people, they make less and less sense the more angry they become.
Glenn Beck.
Let me bring Ben Weingarten in. He's a podcast host, Big Ideas with Ben Weingarten. He started his own media company. He's, I think, from the first graduating class of the Blaze, and also with the Federalist. Ben, welcome to the program.
Glenn, thanks so much for having me on.
So I wanted to talk to you about this article that you wrote about Dianne Feinstein, because this is something that is really being buried, and I think this is a really big deal. She is in trouble now because apparently there was a spy in her office for about 20 years, a Chinese spy. Can you first give me any details that we have for sure on that?
Yeah, and of course the media accounts differ from what she tweeted out, and a couple basically trying to obfuscate and deflect from the story. But this employee, the person who matches all the descriptions that we've seen in the media, worked for her for 20 years, was listed most recently as an office director out in her California office. He was her driver, listed as her gopher for a bunch of assignments, and also her liaison to the Asian community, where, of course, naturally, he would have coordinated and communicated with Chinese authorities, among others. And what we've been told by her and the media is that about 5 years ago, she found out that this employee, through the FBI, was being investigated as a potential recruit of essentially China's KGB or FSB, their Ministry of State Security. And she says that she was mortified and immediately he was let go or fired. It's not exactly entirely clear.
Yeah, she said, I learned the facts and made sure the employee left my office immediately.
Right. And of course, based upon our knowledge and given that this person, it appears, is operating freely right now, working for a quote-unquote social justice foundation out in California, which appears to be actually doing a campaign that Chinese propagandists love to propagate, an anti-Japanese one regarding comfort women. It seems like he was never prosecuted, never paid any sort of price. He was just let go and continues to operate freely.
Okay, so wait a minute. Can I mean, I know this is not the crux of the story here, but can you give me the comfort women story? Who cares about, I mean, what is the social justice cause on that one?
Well, the cover for the story, and there's a great piece in a publication called Asia Times, which talks about how the Chinese, of course, are engaged in all sorts of propaganda campaigns information warfare, which we care about so much when it comes to the Russians, but have ignored when it comes to the Chinese, who are probably a far greater threat to us. Essentially, they've engaged in a campaign to focus on Japan's human rights violations during World War II, so-called comfort women, essentially taking female prisoners and pimping them out effectively.
The Japanese in some cases were worse than the Germans. I mean, they were awful, just awful. But what's the point?
So the Chinese like to propagate this story and basically try to cause a backlash against the Japanese, force them to recognize this and repent, etc., as a means of deflecting from China's modern-day human rights.
Okay.
So they have a propaganda effort to hurt the Japanese and make themselves look better.
Okay, but
he works for the Justice Foundation, the apparent spy who was let go, that deals with putting forth that message.
So does anybody care that he was just let go? Why did the FBI say they had a spy and then she dismissed him and then they just let him go?
Well, they claim that what he was passing along to the Chinese Ministry of State Security was political intelligence, quote unquote. So not anything that would have ever threatened national security and that he never accessed sensitive information, etc. But that really doesn't pass muster when you consider he's in her office for 20 years. And let's put Dianne Feinstein's seniority into perspective here. This was someone who was the chairwoman of the Senate Select Intelligence Committee.
Jeez.
So a committee in the Senate that's dealing with the most sensitive, highly classified, top secret kind of information. So imagine someone with the access, even if he was just a driver, which I really don't believe based upon what we've discovered, even if he was just a driver, well, she's having calls about very sensitive issues, or potentially there are listening devices within the automobiles in which she was driven around in her office. I mean, you're talking about someone of a very high rank who had a relationship with the Chinese for 40 years in addition to this one person in her office. And you're telling me that potentially there couldn't have been great exposure to sensitive information? And then the crux of this story is that she has this person in her office. The media is minimizing the story. But the entire missed part of it is that she's had connections to the highest levels of the Chinese Communist Party for 40 years, ever since we opened up diplomatic relations with China. Dianne Feinstein has had direct ties to them. And while she's taken a very pro-Chinese line in terms of expanding trade, dovishness when it comes to the military, and then apologizing for China's human rights violations, and it's all right there in this article laid out, while all that was happening, her husband's investment portfolio was swelling with China-related investments that clearly, directly, and at the very least indirectly benefited from the policies she was supporting. So that's a massive story that's being completely missed and dismissed by this idea that there was one guy, low-ranking, in her office who was let go immediately, and there was no national security ramification to it.
So, Ben, here's the problem. We were just talking about fake news and, that the press is the enemy of the people, which, no, ignorance and apathy is the real enemy to the republic. We all have a responsibility. The press leaves things out. They drop stories, they underplay stories and overplay others for their own agenda. We all know that. What do you suggest? Because the media, we can't change the media. What do you suggest is done with, we have two stories today. Yours, the one that you're talking about here. We also have the story where they were, hey, look, this guy was just out in the, the boonies, and he just made a compound. He brought some kids in. He was a religious zealot. No, he was an Islamic extremist. This was an Islamic terror camp here in the United States. And there's a link to Linda Sarsour. That's not being covered. That's not being covered. So what do we do, Ben?
Yeah, well, in this case, I think you have to look to the silent majority. And if there is a big enough backlash in the public, even if, quote-unquote, mainstream sources, and by the way, I consider mainstream sources basically the communications arm of the Democratic Party. So you have to assume that they're going to minimize and ignore any story that doesn't serve a narrative that they care about. And in this case, I think in their minds, they hate this narrative because it's contrasting Dianne Feinstein and China versus Donald Trump and Russia. And here you have an actual spy and actual policies that were pro-China and actual conflict of interest on the business side. And they don't want to make that contrast with Trump. But I actually think that the political part of this is far secondary to the national security implications, and also the idea that a power like China would try to go after our government and cultivate a relationship for 40 years with Dianne Feinstein. And I have to imagine all sorts of other politicians, because they're very strategic with this stuff. And let's put it in even bigger context. China conducted that Office of Personnel Management hack, where they stole the information on well over 20 million government employees and applicants to be in government. Information that is the most compromising information possible. The profile the government takes to make sure no foreign power, if they find out about this stuff, can compromise you and go after you and your family. China also destroyed our informant network on their mainland, killed our CIA operations there. So put Feinstein in that broader context, and I think there needs to be an outrage and a call for holding the other side up to account, which is, if we really care about foreign meddling, well, China is a far more dangerous threat than Russia, but let's explore foreign meddling from all powers, whether it's China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, North Korea, and let's hold all of our politicians to account. And I do think if there is a big enough outrage, politicians don't like outrage, so the only way this becomes a story is if there is public pressure, and that requires us communicating around, unfortunately, a media that is totally in the tank and doesn't want to deal with these stories. And I think ultimately what you'll see, if this story continues to build and as people continue to dig on this, is that Feinstein will be called to account. But I think you're going to see other people in government close rank around her. And that makes it an even bigger scandal, potentially.
I think, Ben, you're exactly right. It doesn't stop with her. And it doesn't stop with the Democratic Party. I mean, both parties are very dirty from foreign money. You didn't do just one person for 40 years and leave it at that, or one side. You got to make bets on several fronts. Ben, thank you so much. You can find this story right now at The Federalist. You can also find it at benweingarten.com. benweingarten.com.
And we'll tweet it as well from Glenn Beck and World of Stu in case you want to read it. It's an in-depth read, and there's a lot of information to take in.
A lot of information.
But a lot of questions it causes you to ask. And we don't yet have all the answers.
Glenn Beck.
If you look at the headlines in the mainstream media, you are going to see a story about some guy. We don't even know who he is. Some guy who had 15 kids. He was out in the middle of nowhere in a compound doing exorcisms. And he's training kids to kill. Why, my gosh, he's got to be an NRA member. He's got to be a crazy Christian with those exorcisms. No, no, when you actually hear the names and then look the names up, you realize this is an Islamic extremist camp where they have 15 kids and they're training them to shoot other children in schools. There's also a neat little tie to Linda Sarsour. But the media can't be bothered with all of that. This is really about guns. This is what this is really about. Andrew McCarthy is with us. He's a contributing editor of the National Review. Hello, Andrew. How are you?
I'm doing great, Glenn. I think probably we could say guns don't kill people. Sharia supremacism kills people.
Yes, I would think that would be a good headline. It would be a good headline. So, Andrew, tell me about this guy. Tell me what this is.
Well, the guy who is at the center of this incident down in New Mexico, Glenn, is named Siraj Wahaj, and that name is a blast from the past because he is a guy who came up in our investigation of the blind sheikh that led to the trial of those characters after the World Trade Center was bombed.
So if anybody doesn't know who you are, explain your connection to that, Andrew.
I was the lead prosecutor in the blind sheikh case back in the mid-'90s, and We convicted about 12 jihadists for actually, the main charge was seditious conspiracy to make war against the United States, and it included the World Trade Center bombing and a plot to bomb the Lincoln and Holland tunnels, the FBI's Manhattan headquarters, and the like. So,
okay, so now
kind of ahead of the curve.
The father, the guy who you know, because he was a character witness for the defense of the blind sheikh. So he got on the stand and he was, oh, this guy's great. Tell me about him.
You know, it's very interesting, Glenn. He precisely didn't do that, and his testimony was one of the most interesting parts of the whole trial. I was a much better weaselly lawyer back then than I am now. So we had put out a letter at the beginning of the trial. In most of these big conspiracy cases, the government's required to tell the defense who the unindicted co-conspirators are, other people who come up in the evidence who aren't listed in the indictment. And he was one of the names we gave, but we didn't identify him specifically as a co-conspirator. We said that we reserved the right to call him that.
Okay.
So he was somebody who hovered around the investigation, but he was not implicated in the main plots that we had, so he wasn't charged. But the interesting thing about him is he is a committed Sharia supremacist. He was actually the first Muslim imam to give the opening invocation in a session of Congress. He was a fairly prominent guy, and he was very open about his beliefs, which were, he's a dyed-in-the-wool Islamic extremist. And he was asked by, I think some of these defense lawyers thought that he was going to be really helpful to them. And one of them, who was a blind sheikh's lawyer, said, "You never heard anything about the blind sheikh coming to the mosque and saying that we should rob banks for the jihad?" And Siraj said, "Well, as a matter of fact."
So wait a minute. So is he just he's not a guy who thinks it's wrong. He's just unapologetic about it because it.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. And if you had such a person, and he had a son who, by the way, was about I want to say 15 or 16 at the time, and then you learned, flash forward to 2018, that this is how the son turned out. How shocking is that?
Not at all.
Right. So. Yeah, I think that there's two things, Glenn, if I may, about this that are kind of disturbing. One is I looked at the reporting from CBS and the AP this morning, and it seems to me like we're still doing the Obama administration countering violent extremism, where we're not supposed to factor in the ideological component of this, and we wait until something horrific happens. So they say here that the FBI did an investigation here that went on for a couple of months, and they decided that they didn't have enough probable cause to get a search warrant for the compound. And I mean, that sounds crazy to me. I don't mean to laugh about it, but I feel like I've been hitting my head against the same brick wall for 25 years. If you got a bunch of people who are operating under an ideological system where they consider themselves to be at war with the Western society, and they're living in a parallel society, as it were, in New Mexico, and you don't think that contributes to probable cause, given all the evidence we have of what the link is between the ideology and the violent action? I just think that's crazy.
So Andrew, tell me what they did find when they went in there.
Well, they found lots and lots of firearms. Evidently, they have found human remains, which haven't been identified but are suspected of being the younger Wahaj's son. We don't know. We should stress that, at least as far as I know, that hasn't been confirmed. And they have found evidence, as you pointed out at the beginning, that essentially they were schooling these kids who were there, who, by the way, were being held in these really awful, dilapidated conditions. But they were being schooled in Sharia supremacism, including the notion that they are at war with the West, and they were being trained to commit violent actions in schools, which is, I mean, if you're going to take this ideology seriously, that's what it teaches.
So where did these kids come from? They were 15.
Yeah, I don't know exactly whether they're all local or, whether people moved from great distances to come there. But I think the disturbing thing is that you do have some of these sort of parallel societies within a society that pop up in areas of the South and the Southwest. So they haven't gotten a lot of attention, but it happens.
Now, this weekend, the white supremacists, which is supposed to be a big zilch and very low turnout, having a big white supremacist march, and the media is going to make that into they're the most dangerous people in the country. Well, there's somebody that you should watch. This is actual. These are people who are actually training kids to kill. And there's a connection to Linda Sarsour. Have you seen this, Andrew?
Yeah, well, I know that there's a Siraj Wahhaj the Elder connection to Sarsour. And in my experience, Glenn, a lot of these people end up running in the same circles.
Sure.
I mean, I used to have to look at this a little bit more carefully. So you'd see these conventions that they would have every few weeks or so, and it's always the same names that come up again and again. And most of them have some kind of tie to an organization that is either, quasi-formally the Muslim Brotherhood or influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood or what have you. But it's a network that's been operating here really since the 1980s.
So she gave a speech at the last ISNA conference, and she praised Senior as her mentor, a guy who meets with her on regular occasion, somebody that when she gets down encourages her, teaches her about Islam, et cetera, et cetera. What does that say about her?
Well, it says that when we talk about Islamic extremism, nobody wants to talk about what it is they're being extreme about. We just sort of cavalierly use that expression. And I am here to tell you that if you subscribe to this belief system, that is the people who do, whether they are trying to move the Sharia supremacist agenda along the lines of, legal action, media action, and that sort of stuff, or you are the pointy end of the spear who are doing, the kind of teaching and direct action that Siraj the Younger appears to have been involved in. This is all under the umbrella of the same threat to the West. And I know, people want to throw stuff at you when you say that, but it's a fact that Linda Sarsour and Al-Qaeda have a lot more in common than, say, Linda Sarsour and you and me. And that's the world we're living in, whether people want to face up to it or not.
Andrew, you've always been a clear thinker and an outspoken advocate for actually looking the problem in the eye, and I appreciate your service and your time today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Glenn.
You bet. Andrew McCarthy, he's contributing editor of the National Review and lead prosecutor on the Blind Sheikh case back in the 1990s.
Glenn Beck.
The best of the Glenn Beck program.